Hello everyone and welcome to chapter 24 on the digestive system. So first we want to do an overview over the entire digestive system, which is also called your alimentary tract or canal, also known as your GI tract, which is short for gastrointestinal tract. We also have the category of accessory organs. So these are primarily glands. So our salivary glands would fall into this category, your gallbladder, your liver, as well as your pancreas. And what they're going to do is secrete fluids into the GI tract. So let's look at the figure here on the right. We have, of course, starting our digestive system over at the mouth or the oral cavity. This is where we have the accessory organs of our salivary glands and our tonsils located in here as well to fight any pathogens that come our way. Then we move posteriorly and into the pharynx, specifically the oropharynx. We are going to have some tubular mucus glands here. And then we continue down, where'd my mouse go? Continue down the esophagus, where we also have some tubular mucus glands, and that will take us down to the abdomen where it'll connect with our stomach. And we have a ton of different glands in here that we'll discuss that are going to be tubular as well. From there, we'll move into the small intestines. And our small intestines is made up of three different parts. We have the first part, which is the duodenum. Then we have the jejunum, and then the ileum. And I just realized that this is listing them in not the correct order. So in your notes, you can move ileum to the end. So they'll be in order from proximal to distal. And then we have connections with our liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. All of these three structures or organs are going to secrete digestive juices into the duodenum, specifically the second part. So our small intestines is then going to lead us into the large intestines, which will include the cecum, which would be this blind pouch right over here, and continue up across the abdomen, moving on down, and eventually to the rectum and the anal canal. And they are going to contain mucus glands within them as well. And of course, the contents will be defecated at that point. So what are the functions of our digestive system? One of the functions is ingestion, of course, bringing that food into our stomach. We have two, mastication, which literally means chewing. So we are going to masticate by chemical digestion, and we want a large surface area to break down large particles. And then mechanically, we are using our muscles to break the food apart. That will help with that chemical digestion. Third, we have propulsion. So first, within propulsion, we have deglutition, and this is swallowing. Next phase is peristalsis, and this is what we see over here on the right. We have smooth muscles that are found in our GI tract that will contract involuntarily and create this wave-like motion in order to propel the food, or at this point in the esophagus, it's called the bolus. Once we get into the stomach, we call that food chyme because it's a little bit more liquefied. So anyway, the whole process of peristalsis is to contract those smooth muscles to help propel that food further down the digestive tract. And then we have our mass movements in the large intestines. So for that, we are going to take a look at a few diagrams. This one here is discussing peristalsis once again, where we have contraction above or superior to that, I should say proximal to that bolus, and that causes the bolus to want to continue and move down the tract, since these muscles that are more distal will be relaxed. And so this is the other larger movements that we're going to see. This is called segmental contraction. And so we have a secretion introduced into our digestive tract And what it does is it causes these contractive waves that will shift the food within the tract, and this will also help to mix the contents up as we have these wave-like contractions taking place. So instead of the food just being clumped together with mucus, it's going to spread it apart and mix it a bit more. And then our fifth function is secretion. So we're going to be able to lubricate, liquefy, and digest our food in this way. I mentioned previously that mucus was going to be found mixing with our food, and we talked a lot about some mucus glands along our GI tract. And what that does is it helps to lubricate the food and the lining of our digestive tract in order to have the food kind of stick together and move as a little bit more of a unit, and it stops it from creating too much friction within the walls of our organs in our GI tract. And so it will also have some digestive enzymes secreted throughout our GI tract to break down the food as well. We go through this process of liquefaction, and that also will assist in moving the food through more easily, and we can also attain the nutrients within the food and absorb them into the walls of our GI tract and eventually into our blood more easily. We'll also have some bile move into our GI tract. Once again, this will be secreted into the duodenum portion from the liver and gallbladder. And what that assists with is emulsifying fat. So the way that water and oil separate out, this is kind of what we're doing with the fats when we say emulsify fats. And then we mentioned that some enzymes will be used too. That is a form of chemical digestion to mix the food and liquefy it. Sixth function is digestion. This is mechanical and chemical. We've already kind of talked about this when we discussed mastication. And absorption is huge function here. So as we're moving the food through, there are going to be different areas in the GI tract that will allow absorption of different nutrients and move them into our bloodstream or circulation or within our lymphatic system. And lastly, we have elimination, which will collect our waste products and remove it from our body in the form of feces, and this process is called defecation. So next we have table 24.1, and this is just a summary of all the specific functions that take place throughout the GI tract. So I'll let you read through those on your own. We're going to visit each of the organs in just a moment and discuss their functions as well. So before we do that, we want to talk about some histology of the GI tract. So your digestive tract or GI tract is made up of 4 prominent layers. It is made up of, and I'm going to reference this picture up here. First, the inner layer is the mucosa. The second layer is the submucosa. Third layer, here they have listed as musculopropria, but it's most well known as muscularis externa. And the last layer will be your adventitia or serosa. So any part, whether it's the esophagus or your small intestines, large intestines, they will all have these layers. And so what we're looking at and discussing is if we were to take that tube, and so I'm going to draw a big tube here. Let's just say this is my esophagus for ease. And inside the esophagus, we of course have the lumen. So I'm just going to put lume here for short. That's the very center. In the lumen, we're going to have the food moving through. And so right near that lumen, that is the deepest layer, will be the mucosa. So I'm just going to put an M here. And then the layer after that will be your submucosa. So I'm just going to put an S here. And then you guys guessed it. Next layer is going to be your muscularis externa. Okay, and then your very last layer will be your adventitia or serosa, depending on where you are. So I just wanted to give you a visual of what we're really discussing here. And then now we'll talk about the details. So that inner mucosa, the one that's right next to the food here, this layer that I'm kind of coloring in, this is going to have mucous epithelium, which is basically stratified squamous epithelium in the areas of your mouth, oropharynx, esophagus, and the anal canal. But in other areas of the GI tract, we will see simple columnar epithelium. So you should know the difference between those two. And then we will have with it, this is pictured over here in the top image here, underneath that epithelium, we have the lamina propria that is made up of loose connective tissue that will help support that epithelium. And then we have a thin layer of muscle here called the muscularis mucosa, and this is made up of smooth muscle. So all of these three things we just discussed are found only within the mucosa. Now if we go to our second layer, which is our submucosa, then we are going to see no epithelium here, but rather connective tissues. So this is the second layer. I don't know if it's worth pointing this out in this picture because we have a couple other images to look at. So our second layer, just the connective tissue, we've got our neurovasculature in here. So lots of nerves, blood vessels, and we'll also see some small glands. And what's really important is this parasympathetic submucosal plexus, which we'll discuss a little bit later in our lecture. So just remember, we've got this important nervous tissue here, the parasympathetic submucosal plexus. I have some other figures here. This esophagus is just to show you the stratified squamous epithelium. Here in the stomach, we can see that, well, it's not too clear, but you could kind of make out that there's simple columnar epithelium over here. They're going up and down because we're going to have something called gastric pits in this area. And then same thing over here in our small intestines. The simple columnar epithelium are lined up next to each other right over here. So they're gathered around in this wave-like fashion. And then lastly, we have the large intestines here, and we've got that simple columnar epithelium in that region. And then the picture in the bottom here is one of the esophagus. So once again, we see that stratified squamous epithelium here, part of the mucosa, lamina propria, and there's that thin muscle here, the muscularis mucosa. Then our second layer is the submucosa, and our third layer is the muscularis externa. Now notice there's a little bit of difference in the muscle tissue here, and that's because we'll learn that muscularis externa has a longitudinal layer and a circular layer. And then our fourth layer is the adventitia. Oh, my drawing is covering up this image here. Let me get rid of that. Post this back up. There we go. So this is just another image showing you that simple columnar epithelium. Here's our lamina propria. And then we see this lacteal being pointed out over here. This is a picture, I believe, of our small intestines. So we have these finger-like projections that are called villi. And within the villi, we have blood vessels and lacteals. Lacteals are lymphatic capillaries that contain lymph within them. It's more of a fatty lymph, and fat shows up white because it can't pick up the dyes. And so that's what we're seeing over here, is that fatty lymph being pulled away from the villi. So next let's talk about that third layer, the muscularis externa. And this is either made up of 2 or 3 layers of smooth muscle, although typically it is 2 layers. And so the areas of exception is where we have the esophagus. The upper 1/3 is going to be striated muscle rather than the smooth muscle that we see here. We'll also have another important plexus here. Remember, plexus is referring to our nervous system, and this is called your myenteric plexus. So together, we just learned about that submucosal plexus in our previous layer, the second layer. And so together, the myenteric and submucosal plexi are going to be called your enteric or the intramural plexus. And so the enteric plexus, it's kind of like its own brain. It regulates itself rather than having to go to the central nervous system and having that regulate it. So this muscularis externus layer is really important in controlling the movement and secretion within our GI tract. This is what's going to help us with that peristalsis and segmental movement. So you can also see in this picture over here that this would be our mucosal layer, submucosal layer over here. And then we see our first muscularis layer here, which is our inner circular layer. So what this means is that the muscle fibers are going in this direction, or I like to visualize this as the way a water bottle label goes around the water bottle. So imagine that's muscle, and if that label were to contract, it is going to squeeze that bottle, and of course the water would squirt out of the water bottle. And then the outer layer is our second muscular layer here that we see, and these fibers are moving up toward you. So they're going through your computer screen up out toward you. And the way I like to think of this is if you're using a water bottle, once again, if you run your fingers vertically going up and down the water bottle, and imagine those are the muscle fibers. So if those muscle fibers contracted, that would shorten the water bottle. So that's how these muscles are going to work within the GI tract. And our fourth and final layer is the serosa or the adventitia. And once again, this is made up of connective tissue, and that's what we're seeing down here. This one is a serosa. And when we see that serosa present, this is called the visceral peritoneum. So visceral peritoneum means that this is a serous membrane, and this is going to be adhered onto our abdominal organs. But other areas where we see adventitia more, this is just connective tissue that is blending, that is blending to connective tissue with surrounding structure. So it's really just helping to support and hold that organ in place. So also in this picture, we could see the submucosa. Probably use a darker pen color here so you could see this. Here's our inner circular layer, and I like this image better because you can see that the fibers are going in this longitudinal direction more. Here's our outer longitudinal layer. So these fibers, once again, they're going through your computer screen and over to you. Here's another image of what that looks like. So here is your inner circular layer. We see those fibers are going around and across our computer screen, whereas here these fibers are going through your computer screen. This is your longitudinal section. And just some more images here of the adventitia, where you see this in the esophagus. Okay, and this is more of a summary slide. So here's our lumen, here's our mucosa. Remember, that's made up of your epithelium, which will be different depending on which area of the GI tract you are. We have the lamina propria, and then that muscular layer, the muscularis mucosa. And then we have second layer here, your submucosa. We call this your neurovascular layer, lots of blood vessels, and we also have that submucosal plexus. Your third layer is made up of that muscularis externa, with your inner layer being circular and your second layer or outer layer being longitudinal, and this also has a plexus within it, the myenteric plexus. Both of these plexi together create your enteric plexus. And lastly, we have your serosa or your adventitia, depending on where you are. So next we need to talk about how we are regulating the digestive system. So if we are discussing nervous system regulation, we have local control through that enteric nervous system. Remember, this is made up of your submucosal plexus and your myenteric plexus. We're going to have both sensory, I shouldn't say both, I should say all types of neurons, sensory, motor, and interneurons. And it helps to coordinate our peristalsis and regulate local reflexes. And we'll discuss what some local reflexes are. In general, though, we do have coordination with our central nervous system. This helps us with some reflexes because of the senses associated with food, such as sight, smell, and taste. This is most likely our parasympathetic nervous system working. Remember, that is our rest and digest portion of our autonomic nervous system, whereas our sympathetic nervous system is going to inhibit digestion, really. So it's going to inhibit muscle contraction, secretion, and also blood flow to our digestive tract. Then we have our chemical regulation, which will deal with our hormones such as gastrin and secretin. We'll talk about those in a moment. And also creating paracrine chemicals such as histamine, which will help our local reflexes in our enteric nervous system and control the conditions of our internal environment of the digestive tract, such as our pH levels. So first, let's discuss our peritoneum. This is really a serous membrane. We saw these similar layers to our in our respiratory system as our visceral pleura and parietal pleura. So now we're just in the abdomen, so we're going to call this peritoneum here. So our visceral peritoneum, that is going to cover our organs. So let me see what images we have here to depict this. This is going to be the red line here covering the liver, the red line over here around the stomach, and also the red lines you see going over the intestines. Whereas our parietal pleura, this is lining our abdominal cavity. So it is all of this blue line in here. And then we have structures that are retroperitoneal. If you think of the word retro, it means like backward, right? So these are all structures that we are going to find behind the peritoneum that we see in the blue here. So that would include your pancreas, kidney, and a portion of the duodenum. What do we need to mention here? So this is showing you the development of some of the mesenteries. So let's orientate ourselves. Here is posterior, so this is our vertebrae, and this is our GI tract. And so what we first have here is going to be the dorsal mesentery, and then as we get some other organs developing here, we will start to develop a connection anteriorly. And so we would call this the ventral mesenteries. And some structures will be developing posterior to this peritoneum. And so we would say that these organs are retroperitoneal, because they don't have any mesenteries that are associated with it. So more on these mesenteries, we are looking for areas where we have two layers of peritoneum with a thin layer of loose connective tissue between them. So these mesenteries are created so that we can have some blood vessels and also nerves traveling to areas like the small intestines. So the first thing that you see in this image up here is this greater omentum. This is also known as the fatty apron, and it really does look like this within a cadaver, or if you've ever dissected a cat. It just is a little sheet made up of fat that kind of covers up the rest of the digestive organs that would lie underneath here. And so connections we would have here is the greater curvature of the stomach and also the transverse colon. So to get to that, it kind of folds underneath and attaches. The transverse colon would be posterior to all this here. The lesser omentum is, do I have a picture of that? Not the best image. Yeah, I don't think I have one here. No. This is going to connect the lesser curvature of the stomach. So it's down in this area here and attaches to the duodenum, part of the duodenum, and also the liver and diaphragm. Then we have these structures called mesocolons. So you can see that really well over here, this transverse mesocolon as it's connecting the transverse colon here over to the abdominal wall. Then we have our sigmoid mesocolon that is not pictured here, but your sigmoid colon is in this region here. So we would find that tissue along with it. And the mesoappendix, which isn't pictured here either. As far as mesenteries, we also have this mesentery that holds the small intestines in place, and we're going to have blood vessels and nerves traveling through here. So next we're going to discuss the pathway down through the GI tract, and as we go through we'll discuss all of the wonderful details. So in our oral cavity, obviously it is bounded by our lips anteriorly, or the fauces, and opening to the pharynx back in here. So the space that we have between our lips and cheek, which we don't see pictured here obviously, but that little pouch that you can kind of store food in between your teeth and the lips and cheeks, that is called your vestibule. Now our oral cavity proper is the area that is medial to our alveolar processes. So that's all of this space in here is our oral cavity proper. And all of this area is lined with moist stratified squamous epithelium. So our lips and cheeks, we need both of these for mastication and also speech. Our lips are also known as our labia and is surrounded by a muscle called the orbicularis oris. And so this muscle helps us to kind of pucker our lips anteriorly, and we have keratinized stratified squamous epithelium exteriorly. We have this area greatly vascularized, and that's why you will have more of that red or pink color to it because of the blood flow to this region. Now, if you've ever lifted your lips up and away from your teeth, either the top part or the inferior part, this is called your labial frenula. And so this would be the superior one. And if we pull down the inferior lip, that would be called the inferior labial frenula, or frenulum for singular. And then we have our facial muscles that will also help us to move our lips around, such as the buccinator, and we also have depressor angularis that can pull your lip down, and the zygomaticus major minor that would be pulling your lip upward. So your cheeks, you already know, are your lateral walls of your oral cavity, and then once again a mention of this buccinator muscle kind of helps you to kind of compress your cheeks in order to play winded instruments, or babies that have to suckle for milk will have a greatly developed buccinator muscle. And we also have a buccal fat pad in this region as well. You could see that pictured right in here. So within your oral cavity, we also have the palate. We have the hard palate, that is made up of your maxilla and palatine bone. And as we move more posteriorly, we will run into your soft palate that is covered by skeletal muscle and connective tissue. And then posteriorly hanging from that soft palate, we have your uvula. And this projects posteriorly so that when we eat food or drink food, this uvula will fly on backward and cover up your nasal cavity here. So when we look at your tongue, we see that it is very muscular and it has a free anterior surface. Of course, it is attached posteriorly, and this is covered with moist stratified squamous epithelium. And we have two different classifications for these muscles. We have our intrinsic muscles that are going to change the shape of the tongue. So if you're one of those people that can kind of curl their tongue or flip it backward, then you are very talented and you have great intrinsic muscles. So I wonder if you all are curling your tongues right now, trying to see if you can do it. I think I have a picture. No, I didn't. But so we would have most of that musculature within the tongue itself. And then your extrinsic muscles are going to lie outside of the tongue. That will help you do things like stick your tongue out. So we would call that protrusion of the tongue, and then bringing it back would be retraction of the tongue. And also being able to move the tongue side by side is utilizing these extrinsic tongue muscles. Now you may have wondered, what is that string attaching the tongue to the floor of the oral cavity? That is called your lingual frenulum, lingual meaning tongue, of course. And then we could take a look at the tongue itself. And on there, you may have noticed you have these papillae, which some of them will contain some taste buds. So we'll take a look at some pictures of what those papillae look like in a moment. But if we look at the tongue more posteriorly, we're not going to have any papillae there and fewer taste buds. We do have some lymphoid tissue associated with the tongue, and that's going to be found at the base of the tongue. I think I have it in this picture here. This is your lingual tonsil. So the job of the tongue is really to move the food around in the mouth. We utilize it in speech and also in swallowing. So here is a picture of the tongue, and then you've probably noticed more in the back of your tongue, these larger papillae. So we're going to have a couple different types of papillae that'll be found on the mucosa of our tongue. We have the filiform papillae, and that's going to give our tongue a bit more roughness to it in order to have some friction to catch the food or water, and they are going to be the only ones that do not contain taste buds. They will give the tongue a whitish appearance, and you'll see this really well developed in cats as well as dogs. Next, we have the fungiform papillae, and you will find this looking more of a mushroom shape to it, scattered all over the tongue, and it has a very abundant vascular core that is going to give it a reddish look on the tongue. Next, we have the valate or the circumvallate papillae, and these are going to, they look like big mushrooms to me, and you're going to have usually 8 to 12 of them that'll form this V shape on the back of the tongue. And then lastly, we have your foliate papillae, and this will be found on the lateral aspects of the posterior tongue. Here are just some pictures of what your circumvallate papillae may look like. So there's a histology plate, and this is an actual physical picture here. And then we have your foliate papillae here on the lateral side of the tongue. And you could also see the image here, and embedded on the papillae will be the taste buds. So if you were to kind of, whoa, how did that click out? If you were to kind of illustrate this for yourself, if this is my papillae, right embedded within that epithelium is where those taste buds are going to be. And each of these taste buds has a little taste pore in the center of it. My picture is not looking so great. I think I have a better one coming up discussing taste buds, so we'll wait until we see that one. Now, when it comes to our teeth, we have two sets. We have our primary dentition teeth, um, which are also called your milk teeth, and these exist within your childhood. And of course, we are going to have less teeth when we are younger because we have not as much space within our oral cavity for more teeth. So as we go through our childhood, right around the age of 6, we'll start to lose our teeth and get in our adult or permanent or secondary teeth, which we will have a total of 32 teeth at that point in time. And the types that we have are incisors, so those are going to be right in the center. Then we have our canines, which are the sharper looking ones on the lateral sides, and then our premolars and um, our actual molars, first, second, and sometimes third. Some people don't get third molars. These are known as your wisdom teeth, that if you don't have enough space within your oral cavity, you have to get them removed. Otherwise, they're going to cause a change within your bite or a shift within your teeth. So your teeth are going to help you with mastication and speech. If we look at the anatomy here, we could see that the top portion is called the anatomic crown. Enamel is going to cover this region of the tooth. And you always hear in the dental commercials, this toothpaste is going to preserve your enamel, because once it wears away, there's no coming back from it. It's not going to grow back. You can get um, this portion taken off and a clinical crown put in above the gum line in order to kind of save the tooth from any type of infection that's taking place. Also, right below or starting at the gum line and down, where we see a little bit more of a constriction, excuse me, of the tooth. This is called the neck. And then we have the enamel that we already mentioned as the outermost layer here. This is non-living tissue. It's acellular, but serves as a very important protective component of our teeth. Below that, you may be wondering, what is this orange portion in here? That is called your dentin, and this is living cellular calcified tissue. So you want to stop the cavity. So if you start to see cavity going through the enamel, you want to stop them from getting to this layer because it is live and has an important role in holding the tooth in the socket. And then further, that infection or bacteria can continue down into your pulp cavity, which this is where all the vital stuff is, your blood vessels, nerves, and we also have some connective tissue in there. So once it gets there, then we can, of course, have that travel within the bloodstream and infect the tooth. Holding the tooth in place is also these periodontal ligaments. So you could see them attaching to the tooth into the areolar processes or spaces here within the maxilla and mandible. And then lastly, we have this fancy word, gingiva, for our gums, and it's made up of dense fibrous connective tissue covered by stratified squamous epithelium. So with mastication, we mentioned how that refers to chewing. We've got our incisors and canines that will help us bite or cut off food, and molars are going to help us grind our food down. So the muscles that are going to be involved in mastication are going to be your masseter muscle. So it's a muscle that just covers this area of the jaw here that will help to elevate your mandible, and also your temporalis. You may see this muscle pulsating as people chew. That tendon comes on down and attaches to the mandible to also help elevate the mandible. And also your medial and lateral pterygoids. So here we could see pictured your lateral pterygoids and your medial pterygoids. So if you think that word pterygoid, it sounds like a pterodactyl, you would be correct because these are winged muscles. So that's why they were named that. So the medial pterygoid is going to help with elevation of the mandible, whereas the lateral pterygoid, that's going to help with depression of the mandible. And in order to protract the mandible, meaning you're bringing your chin anteriorly or lateral or medial excursion, so moving your jaw from side to side, we're going to use your pterygoids as well as your masseter muscle for that. And then to retract your chin, meaning bringing it back to place from pulling your chin out, would be retraction. So we also have this mastication reflex that takes place. So our medulla oblongata has descending pathways from the cerebrum that are going to give us conscious control. And it's controlling our basic movements involving chewing. So now we'll discuss our salivary glands. We've got 3 total. Our parotid gland is the largest one, and we're going to find it just anterior to the ear and external to this masseter muscle over here. You could see the duct coming out of that parotid gland that is going to open into our oral vestibule next to the second molar here in the upper portion. And this will secrete a serous type of fluid. Next, we have your submandibular gland, and your submandibular gland is going to be medial to the body of the mandible, and its duct is going to open at the base of the lingual frenulum. So you can kind of see this over here. And this has mixed serous and mucus fluid. And lastly, we have your sublingual gland over here, and this is found anterior to our submandibular gland and underneath the tongue, or inferior to the tongue. And you could see that we have these many ducts that are coming out from it. We should have about 10 to 12 of them from the floor of the mouth. And we will have mixed serous and mucus fluid here, but it's going to be primarily mucus. And you could see the parotid gland over here in this image. Here is our sublingual, and here is our submandibular. We also have some lingual glands that are going to be small and coiled tubular glands on the surface of our tongue. Now our salivary glands are going to make our saliva, which is important for preventing bacterial infection. It has things like lysozyme and lactoferrin that are antimicrobial. It's also going to help with lubrication to move the food back into the pharynx for swallowing. And it contains an enzyme known as salivary amylase that'll break down starch into disaccharides, maltose, and isomaltose. And it can help the food turn into a bolus so that we can swallow it after. And our parasympathetic input causes salivary production. So what we see in this image are some of those ducts. Here are some mucus cells, and the bluish purple here are our serous glands. And this is just another image showing you a histology version of that. So here are our serous acini, which would be creating the serous fluid, and then this is our salivary duct. And I don't think I have a great picture of a mucus gland right there. So moving into swallowing, this is going to take place at the pharynx. The posterior walls of the oropharynx and laryngopharynx are going to contain muscles called pharyngeal constrictors that will assist us with swallowing. And that'll move the food down into the esophagus, back in here, and move it down to the stomach. Now it's as we follow the esophagus, we will move through an area called the esophageal hiatus. I thought I had a picture of this, but I guess I don't. I'll show it to you in another image. Um, and basically this means in our diaphragm we will have an opening that will allow the esophagus to move through into the abdomen in order to attach to the stomach. We've got two sphincters here in the esophagus. We have an upper sphincter that is striated and the lower sphincter that is made up of smooth muscle. So now let's talk about our three phases of swallowing. Remember, another term for swallowing is deglutition. So our first phase is voluntary. The bolus food is going to be moved by our tongue from our oral cavity into our pharynx. Once we get into our pharynx, we know that the upper portion is made up of skeletal muscle, and then the inferior portion is smooth muscle. So this is more of a reflex at this point that is controlled by the medulla oblongata. So our soft palate is going to elevate up. Remember, we want that uvula to swing on up, and our upper esophageal sphincter is going to relax, allowing the food to slide into the esophagus. And that food will continue on down. The sphincter will then, the upper esophageal sphincter will then close. And another thing I forgot to mention is that this epiglottis is going to have to move downward in order to cover the larynx so that food and water will not get into your lungs. Now we also have an esophageal reflex that occurs when we have a stretching of the esophagus, and that causes our enteric nervous system to initiate peristalsis, those wave-like contractions to move that bolus down. This is just another image here of the three phases of swallowing, so you can go through this on your own. And that brings us to the stomach. So we have two openings within the stomach that is really going to be the same thing as that lower esophageal sphincter. So this is also called your gastroesophageal sphincter or cardiac sphincter in this region over here. And then the other one is where we're going to have the stomach connect to the duodenum, the first part of the small intestines, and that is called your pyloric sphincter. Pylorus means gatekeeper, so this is our gatekeeper to decide when the food from the stomach is moving into the small intestines. So now let's talk about a couple of the different parts of the stomach. We have the cardiac portion, which is the region right where the esophagus is entering in. Then we have the fundus, and if we want to find the fundus, we draw a line from where the esophagus is entering in to the opposite side, and it's this dome-like structure that is the fundus. The body is the main mass of the stomach, and then the pyloric or antrum and canal is found here closer to the pyloric sphincter. Now we also have on the left side of the stomach would be the greater curvature, and over on the left side of the stomach we have the lesser curvature here, and this is where we're going to have the greater and lesser omenta attaching. So now some histology on the stomach. We are going to have those four layers we discussed: the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and serosa. So notice how our muscularis externa has three layers now. We have an inner oblique layer. So this means that the fibers are going in a diagonal. Then we have our circular layer as the middle layer and longitudinal as our outer layer. You'll also notice that inside the stomach here, we have a bunch of folds, and these folds are called rugae, or I like to think of it as reggae, because when you listen to reggae, you just feel very fluid and wave-like, just how we see these rugae in here. And they're really there to increase surface area here, and you'll see them folded up like this when the stomach is empty. When the stomach is full, all of these rugae stretch out and flatten. And this is where you could see some gastric pits here too. We'll talk about some of the cells in here. So looking at the histology, we can see that it's made up of simple columnar epithelium, and it's made up of mucus cells or mucous neck cells, which you see in the pink here. We are also going to have it secrete two-layer coat of alkaline mucus that will move up from the pits and into the stomach. We are going to have the surface layer trapped by carbonate-rich fluid that is beneath it. And you got your gastric pits. I think I already mentioned that. And these glands are going to produce our gastric juice. So let's go through each of these cells and we'll talk about which ones create that gastric juice. They're all kind of working together. So we talked about our mucous neck cells, but we also have our parietal cells in blue and our chief cells that are in purple, and lastly the enteroendocrine cells, which are they pictured here? I don't believe so, but maybe they're these little purple ones that are embedded here and there. So our mucous neck cells are going to be the ones to secrete the mucus. Parietal cells, these blue ones, are very important because they are going to be secreting hydrochloric acid. This helps our stomach stay within a pH of 1.5 to 3.5 in order to denature protein, activate pepsin, which is an enzyme that breaks down protein, and it'll break down plant cell walls and kill many bacteria. We also have a component called intrinsic factor that is secreted by parietal cells, and this is a glycoprotein needed for us to absorb vitamin B12 within our small intestines. By the way, I forgot to mention that the hydrochloric acid that is secreted by the parietal cell is going to help take the inactive form here of pepsinogen and turn it to the active form called pepsin. And this, once again, will help to break down protein. And we have our chief cells, too, that are helping us out. They're going to secrete the pepsinogen to be turned into the pepsin in the presence of hydrochloric acid. And also it'll secrete lipases that will digest about 15% of lipids. Next, we have your enteroendocrine cell here in green. This has to do with regulatory hormones that it secretes, and that'll secrete it right into the lamina propria that should be right in this region over here. And we have our enterochromaffin-like cells that will release histamine and stimulate acid secretion. Gastrin containing cells are going to secrete gastrin. Simple enough there. And then we have our somatostatin containing cells. These are going to regulate somatostatin, which is responsible for inhibiting gastrin and insulin secretion. So we said that once food moves into our stomach, it becomes more of a liquefied food, and at that point we are going to call it chyme. We mentioned a lot of mucus will be secreted from those mucous neck cells or neck mucus cells, and that'll be viscous and also alkaline, which will be good to kind of limit the acidity within our stomach because we don't want ulcers taking place. It can also help to protect the acidic chyme and the enzyme pepsin. Irritation of our stomach mucosa will cause greater mucus so that it's not a problem later on. Our intrinsic factor, we said, was secreted by parietal cells. It is going to bind with vitamin B12 and help for it to be absorbed. So we need vitamin B12 in order for DNA synthesis to take place. Next, we have our hydrochloric acid secreted by our parietal cells. It's going to help to kill bacteria. It stops digestion of our carbohydrates by inactivating salivary amylase. It'll also help to denature proteins and convert pepsinogen to pepsin. Pepsinogen is going to be packaged in zymogen granules, which are released by exocytosis. And pepsin will catalyze the breaking of the covalent bonds in the protein. So here's a great little picture that shows the hydrochloric acid production. I'm not going to hold you responsible for knowing this slide for your exam, but I thought I'd leave it here for you to see the entire process take place. So before we talk about the cephalic phase, I'm going to end this screencast and we'll pick up with the rest in a new one.